What if everything you learned in school about the past was polished for comfort rather than truth? That's the uncomfortable start. Many widely held beliefs are simplified, exaggerated, or simply false, and we keep living with those stories. Over the next chapters, I'll pull apart 33 of the biggest historical myths and explain why they stuck around. Stay with me, because understanding these falsehoods changes how we see our own history and our future. Before we dive into specific lies, it helps to know why myths endure. Simple stories, national pride, bad textbooks, and dramatic art all smooth messy facts into memorable myths. People prefer tidy narratives over complicated truth, and institutions sometimes keep myths because they serve a purpose. With that in mind, let's begin unpacking 33 commonly believed falsehoods and discover the real stories beneath them. The idea that Columbus discovered America erases the millions of people already living here for thousands of years. Indigenous civilizations had complex cities, trade networks, and histories long before 1492. Columbus's voyages began a brutal era of colonization, not the birth of America itself, and calling him a discoverer centers a harmful Eurocentric story. A clearer phrase is that he opened sustained contact between Europe and the Americas, with catastrophic consequences. The image of horned Viking helmets comes from 19th century opera costumes, not archaeology. Real Viking helmets that survive are simple, rounded, and functional without horns that would snag in combat. The horned image stuck because it's theatrical and easily recognizable, so art reinforced the myth. When we swap myth for evidence, Vikings remain fierce and complex seafarers but without the theatrical props. Napoleon's reputation as very short comes from confusion between French and British inches and political cartoons. Contemporary accounts show he was around average height for his time, about 5'6" or 7" in modern measures. The caricature of a short, angry man served British satirists and later popular culture. Correcting this myth matters because it shows how personal insults can morph into widely accepted facts. People often claim the Great Wall is visible from space, but astronauts say it's barely distinguishable without ideal conditions. From low Earth orbit, many human structures blend into natural terrain unless they're huge, like city lights at night. The myth endures because it's a neat boast about human achievement and scale. The real wonder of the wall is its longevity and cultural significance, not its visibility from orbit. The famous quote attributed to Marie Antoinette was likely propaganda created long before she ever said it. It first appeared in a different context and was used to inflame revolutionary sentiment. Attributing the phrase to a queen turned a complex set of social problems into a single villainous moment. Removing the quote doesn't absolve the monarchy's failures, but it helps us understand how catchy lies can fuel political movements. Contrary to popular belief, many medieval scholars knew the Earth was spherical by the early Middle Ages. The flat Earth story was invented later to paint the Middle Ages as ignorant and to glorify modern science. Trustworthy medieval maps and writings show a nuanced, evolving understanding of the world. The true story is more interesting. Scientific knowledge has always been a gradual, sometimes messy process. The image of Pilate dramatically washing his hands to absolve himself comes from biblical narrative and later tradition, and it's more symbolic than straightforward history. Whether he literally performed the gesture or it's a theological device matters, because the story simplifies political realities in Roman Judea. Pilate was a complex figure operating under Roman authority, and the hand-washing scene has become a moral shorthand we repeat without context. Understanding that helps us read sources more carefully. The meme that Einstein failed math is false and distracts from the real nature of his genius. He excelled in math and physics from a young age. The confusion comes from a misinterpreted school report and later myths. This lie persists because people like the idea that brilliance comes after struggle, but in Einstein's case, his strengths were evident early on. True inspiration comes from understanding his curiosity and persistence, not a false origin story. Edison is often credited with inventing the light bulb alone, but the truth involves many inventors and decades of development. He improved and commercialized electric lighting systems, which is an important achievement, yet he relied on teams, suppliers, and earlier discoveries. Simplifying invention into a lone genius story ignores collaboration and the slow accumulation of knowledge. Recognizing many contributors gives a more honest and useful picture of how innovation happens. The Napoleonic Code is named for Napoleon, but it was drafted by committees of jurists and legal experts. Napoleon influenced its goals and political framework, yet the law's content came from collaborative legal work. Calling it his solo invention amplifies the cult of personality and hides the complex process of legal reform. Understanding that helps us see law as collective craftsmanship, rather than the product of a single charismatic leader. The Salem witch trials are often reduced to a simple story of mass hysteria, but the reality included land disputes, family feuds, religious tensions, and political instability. The accusations were entangled with social and economic grievances that made certain households vulnerable. When we simplify this history, we lose insight into how ordinary conflicts can escalate into tragic institutional responses. The trials teach us to look for the structural roots of moral panics, not just individual madness. We often imagine the Renaissance as a complete break from religion, but most artists and thinkers still worked within religious frameworks. The period blended classical learning with devotional life, creating new forms of piety and expression. Painting it as purely secular erases how faith and inquiry intermingled and inspired much of the creative output. Seeing that mixture clarifies how cultural shifts happen gradually, with old and new ideas overlapping. The stereotype that medieval people never bathed is exaggerated and shaped by later propaganda and selective evidence. While sanitation varied by region and class, many medieval communities had public baths, personal hygiene rituals, and practical cleaning methods. Disease patterns were complex, and blaming them solely on filth oversimplifies history. Recognizing the nuance helps us avoid smug modern comparisons and see the real challenges those societies faced. Homer's tales were poetic and mythic, but archaeology shows there likely was a real city at Troy and violent conflicts in the late Bronze Age. Treating the Trojan War as pure fiction ignores evidence that myths often encode memories of actual events. The poetic elements are not falsehoods, they're creative retellings layered onto historical kernels. Exploring that boundary between myth and memory makes ancient stories richer and more meaningful. It's easy to portray the American Revolution as a unanimous cry for liberty, but loyalties were deeply divided. Many colonists remained loyal to Britain, others stayed neutral for safety, and millions, including enslaved people and indigenous nations, faced different stakes entirely. The revolutionary rhetoric of freedom didn't apply equally, revealing contradictions that shaped the new nation. Recognizing those conflicts helps explain ongoing struggles over rights and memory. The Underground Railroad is often pictured as a single, neat network with codes and rails, but it was a loose patchwork of people, routes, and strategies. Enslaved people themselves led many escapes, using knowledge of landscapes and communities, and neighbors often played crucial roles. The railroad metaphor helps explain solidarity and risk, but it can obscure the agency and improvisation that made rescue possible. Honoring that complexity reveals courage in unpredictable forms. The idea that the Middle Ages were a scientific dead zone ignores centuries of learning, translation, and innovation across Europe, the Islamic world, and beyond. Scholars preserved ancient texts, built hospitals, advanced medicine, and improved technologies like mills and metallurgy. Progress was uneven but continuous, and the modern scientific revolution stands on earlier foundations. Looking more carefully at medieval science exposes a river of knowledge that sustained future breakthroughs. Bushido as a single, unchanging code of honor is largely a modern romanticization of samurai behavior. Samurai lived in varied roles, from administrators to peasants, and their conduct changed across time and place. Many followed pragmatic or political orders rather than an abstract ideal. Understanding samurai as social actors rather than mythic paragons reveals how cultural values are often reconstructed to serve later narratives. The Black Death seems sudden, but trade routes, ecological changes, and long-distance travel made societies vulnerable long before the plague struck. Fleas on rats and shifting climate patterns contributed to the spread, and uneven local responses shaped outcomes. Calling it entirely unpredictable understates the interconnectedness of medieval societies that allowed diseases to move quickly. Recognizing those links helps us learn how human systems can amplify biological threats. A common falsehood is that Columbus sailed west because he thought Earth was flat, but educated Europeans already knew the world was spherical. The disagreement centered on how big the planet was and what lay between Europe and Asia. Columbus underestimated distances and miscalculated, not because of flat Earth ignorance, but because of faulty assumptions and optimism. Understanding his error as technical rather than ignorant gives a clearer picture of the risks involved. The French Revolution is often framed as a pure march toward equality, but it was messy, contested, and involved competing visions of justice. Economic desperation, political rivalry, and terror complicated ideological goals, and many groups found themselves excluded from the new rights discourse. Reductionist narratives hide how revolutions can betray their own ideals, and studying those contradictions helps explain the revolution's long-term impact on modern politics and rights movements. The fall of Rome is often imagined as a sudden collapse, but the transformation took centuries and differed across regions. Political authority fragmented, economies shifted, and local identities evolved rather than disappearing instantly. Viewing it as gradual reveals continuity, adaptation, and the birth of medieval institutions from Roman foundations. This perspective prevents simplistic end of civilization stories and highlights human resilience in changing times. Labeling the Crusades purely as religious wars misses the economic, political, and social motives that fueled them. Crusading involved land grabs, trade control, and dynastic ambitions alongside genuine faith-driven calls to arms. The movement's consequences reshaped interactions across the Mediterranean and had deep cultural impacts on both sides. Understanding these multiple motives helps explain why the Crusades are still a potent and contested memory today. The claim that everyone in antiquity died young skews toward extremes and ignores how averages hide survivorship. High infant mortality lowered life expectancy averages, but those who survived childhood often lived into their 50s or 60s. Health, diet, and social status mattered greatly, and many cultures cared for elders with reverence. Seeing lifespan statistics in context prevents misleading conclusions about daily life and social structures in the past. Stereotypes that indigenous societies lack technology ignore remarkable engineering, agricultural innovation, and ecological knowledge worldwide. From Andean terraces to complex irrigation, indigenous peoples developed sophisticated systems adapted to local environments. Labeling those societies as primitive reflects colonial bias rather than reality. Recognizing their technological achievements changes how we value knowledge systems and emphasizes the creativity embedded in diverse human cultures. Although many accused witches were vulnerable, witch hunts also took aim at midlife women, healers, and social outliers as communities scapegoated threats. The pattern shifted across regions and periods, and accusations sometimes targeted people with influence or property. Viewing accusations as purely targeting the poor simplifies a complex social phenomenon rooted in gender, power, and fear. Understanding those dynamics helps explain recurring patterns of scapegoating in history. We often reduce the Industrial Revolution to clever machines, but it transformed labor, family life, urban planning, and the environment. New production systems reshaped where people lived, how children worked, and how cities grew, with long-term social consequences. The pivot wasn't just technical. It was a profound reorganization of daily life that created new social classes and political movements. Keeping that broader view helps us understand modern industrial society's roots and costs. Framing the Cold War as simply the U.S. versus the USSR misses the agency of countries that pursued non-alignment or navigated complex local interests. Many conflicts were fought through proxies, and smaller states exploited superpower competition to pursue their own agendas. The narrative of a neat bipolar struggle flattens the messy mosaic of regional politics. Appreciating that complexity reveals how global power competition works through local actors and shifting alliances. Official Soviet propaganda painted Stalin as an infallible leader, but private opinions were complicated by fear, survival strategies, and dissent. Public praise often reflected coercion or self-preservation rather than genuine admiration, and many suffered under his policies. The myth of unanimous support masks repression and diverse experiences. Recognizing that discrepancy is crucial for understanding how totalitarian systems manufacture consent and silence opposition. The dramatic image of the Berlin Wall falling overnight hides months of political shifts, protests, and miscommunication that led to the opening. Gorbachev's reforms, mass demonstrations, and bureaucratic confusion created a moment that seemed sudden but was actually built on sustained pressure. The narrative of an instant collapse simplifies the incremental erosion of authoritarian power. Seeing the prior work and activism honors those who risked much to open the wall. Calling World War I simply a pointless mistake skips the longer history of imperial tensions, alliance systems, and rising nationalism that made large-scale war increasingly likely. Miscalculations and rigid plans turned a regional conflict into a global catastrophe, but the causes were structural as well as contingent. Understanding the deeper drivers helps explain why such a destructive war unfolded and offers lessons for preventing similar escalations in the future. Moon landing hoaxes have circulated for decades, but the evidence for Apollo missions is overwhelming. Telemetry, rock samples, independent tracking, and thousands of witnesses. Hoax theories spread because conspiracy is a tempting explanation for complex achievements, and because some images fit naive expectations about lighting and shadows. Debunking these claims shows how scientific evidence and multiple independent verifications build robust historical knowledge, even when some refuse to accept it. The old model of history as a parade of great men erases the contributions of millions who built economies, cared for communities, and shaped culture. Social movements, everyday labor, and collective action often drive change more than single charismatic figures. Recentering broad social forces and marginalized voices gives a fuller, richer understanding of why societies change. When we tell history this way, we see our own potential to influence the future. Now that we've seen specific examples, the patterns become clear. Myths survive because they simplify complexity, reinforce identity, or serve political ends. Art and literature make dramatic images stick. Textbooks condense messy debates into neat chapters, and power structures sometimes keep false narratives that support authority. Recognizing these recurring causes helps us spot new myths sooner and ask why a particular story is convenient or comforting. That insight is the first step toward better history. Revisiting Columbus shows how a single narrative can eclipse multiple perspectives. European navigational goals, indigenous societies, and early colonial violence. Looking at primary sources, trade records, and oral histories reveals a complex exchange, often marked by exploitation. Correcting the Columbus myth rebalances historical memory toward those who suffered and those who resisted. This case study shows how focused research can replace hero-centric tales with more honest, inclusive narratives. When we study the Vikings beyond horned helmets, a richer picture emerges. Traders, settlers, craftsmen, and cultural intermediaries who connected distant regions. Burial finds, trade goods, and runic inscriptions show wide-ranging interactions, not just raiding. Emphasizing only violence creates a distorted memory. The archaeological record gives us the nuance we need. This deeper look reminds us that cultural labels collapse too much if we don't examine the evidence closely. Examining indigenous technologies demonstrates practical ecological intelligence. Terraced agriculture, water management, and astronomical knowledge adapted to local conditions. Europeans often dismiss these systems, but they sustained large populations and complex societies. Correcting the primitive myth showcases alternative pathways to complexity and resilience. Understanding these accomplishments also challenges modern assumptions about development and technological superiority. Paintings, operas, and films play a huge role in turning messy history into iconic symbols. The Viking helmet and Marie Antoinette's alleged remark both come from theatrical or literary inventions that stuck. Artistic narratives compress and dramatize, which makes them memorable but also misleading. Learning to read art as interpretation rather than literal record helps us separate evocative storytelling from historical fact. Textbooks have to simplify to teach basic chronology and cause, but simplification often becomes distortion over generations. Condensing centuries into chapters encourages catchphrases and hero narratives that skip nuance. Educators face real constraints, yet textbooks shape what millions regard as unquestionable fact. Encouraging critical reading and supplemental sources can help students see the complexity that a single chapter cannot capture. Governments often promote simplified national myths to strengthen unity or legitimize authority, and those narratives can freeze half-truths into official memory. Monuments and school ceremonies repeat selected stories while leaving uncomfortable parts out. That selective memory can be politically powerful and personally meaningful, yet it can also obscure injustices and complicate reconciliation. Recognizing propaganda's role helps citizens demand fuller, more honest public histories. Human memory reshapes events each time we tell them, smoothing contradictions and adding dramatic touches that feel right. Over generations, oral histories gain layers that reflect communal needs more than precise facts. That's valuable for identity, but can also produce myths when memory outruns evidence. Learning to value stories while checking them against records and multiple perspectives gives a more balanced approach to the past. Museums once reinforced simple narratives, but many now reframe exhibits to include marginalized perspectives and complex contexts. Relabeling displays, incorporating community voices, and showing contested histories help audiences understand the messiness of the past. Museums can be spaces for critical learning rather than static celebration. Watching how curators revise narratives shows how institutions can lead in correcting long-standing myths. Professional historians weigh primary sources, cross-check accounts, and evaluate bias to reconstruct events as accurately as possible. They accept uncertainty and revise interpretations when new evidence appears, which is why history changes over time. This disciplined skepticism distinguishes informed revision from pure denial or conspiracy. Learning basic source evaluation gives anyone tools to separate reliable accounts from comforting but false stories. Hoaxes and forgeries periodically fool experts, reminding us that human error and wishful thinking affect scholarship. Scientific techniques like radiocarbon dating and material analysis catch many frauds, but sometimes false finds persist in public memory. Examining famous forgeries teaches humility and the need for rigorous methods. It also shows how the desire for sensational discoveries can sometimes outpace careful verification. Revising historical narratives raises ethical questions about memory, accountability, and identity. Which stories do we foreground, and how do we handle painful truths that challenge national pride? Ethically rewriting history involves consultation, transparency, and a commitment to facts, not erasing or shaming. Done well, revision can heal by acknowledging harm and offering a fuller picture for future generations. Teaching honest history to children means simplifying without lying, offering multiple perspectives, and explaining uncertainty. Kids can handle complexity when it's presented with clear examples and age-appropriate language. Encouraging curiosity and critical thinking builds resilience against later myths. When educators model questioning and evidence-based conclusions, they prepare learners to understand history as an ongoing conversation. Some historical lies are harmless anecdotes, but others erase suffering, justify oppression, or enable denial of wrongdoing. Myths that protect group pride can also prevent accountability and reconciliation. Recognizing which lies cause harm matters because those are the ones we must confront to build more equitable societies. Using history responsibly means weighing comfort against truth and choosing justice over easy narratives. You can spot historical myths using simple tools. Check primary sources, look for corroboration, examine who benefits from a story, and consult diverse perspectives. Timelines help avoid anachronistic leaps, and scholarly consensus offers reliable guidance when available. Skepticism doesn't mean cynicism, it means testing claims against evidence. These skills make history less mysterious and more empowering for anyone who wants to understand the past. Social media accelerates myth-making by rewarding catchy images and simplified claims that don't survive scrutiny. Viral posts often omit context or sources, and algorithms amplify sensational narratives. That environment makes media literacy essential. Pause, check origins, and read beyond headlines. Building habits of verification slows the spread of falsehoods and supports a more fact-centered public conversation about history. Correcting myths can entrench beliefs if done confrontationally. People often double down to protect identity. Effective debunking is empathetic, evidence-based, and offers alternatives rather than just saying, "You're wrong." Narratives that acknowledge values and gently replace falsehoods with better stories are more persuasive. Understanding psychology helps us communicate history in ways that open minds instead of shutting them down. Truth commissions, museum revisions, and curriculum updates are tools societies use to correct collective memory and address historical wrongs. These processes are imperfect, political, and often contested, but they provide frameworks for public reckoning. Including affected communities in the process increases legitimacy and helps build shared understanding. Repairing memory requires sustained effort, honest documentation, and a willingness to confront uncomfortable truths. History gets weaponized when politicians invoke selective myths to rally supporters, justify policies, or obscure failures. Those narratives can be powerful because they tap into identity and emotion, not just facts. Countering such uses requires clear communication, public education, and civic engagement that demands accountability for historical claims. A healthy democracy depends on citizens who can distinguish propaganda from well-documented historical analysis.